First, I'd like to thank Sarah Marco Hansen, Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, for selecting me as researcher for this project. Okay, let's see how we can do this. It was funded by a grant by Minnesota's Arts and Culture Heritage Fund, better known as the Legacy Amendment. Thanks also to Robin and the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest for co-sponsoring this evening's events, and to Nancy Wagner O'Brien, who you met, of Blue Stem Heritage, who is the project's consultant. Closer? Okay, here, I might have to do this. It's going to be a little awkward, folks, sorry. I also want to thank Brianna O'Brien, Education Director, she's in the back, of the WBLALS. Do you ever call it WBLAS? WBLAS. Rihanna did a virtual talk on the Sophie Wirth camp in 2022 that was useful to me as I began my research, and we had a helpful phone call as I began this talk, to prepare this talk. Sorry, this is not how I expected to have to be doing this. All right, so Sophie Wirth, the camp that's near the lake, was the first Jewish camp in the upper Midwest. It operated on the north shore of White Bear Lake from 1912 to 1944. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the significance of the camp, which includes learning about two Jewish communities, the one that established the camp and the other that was the beneficiary of the camp. So, where was Sophie Wirth Camp? The title of tonight's talk gives a clue. In other words, the camp that's near the lake. So Sarah and Rihanna did this research prior into the location, which indicates that it was located at Stillwater Street and East County Line Road North. What a name of a street. So that little star shows you where that is. It's not far from here. And here's a view if you were standing at that street intersection, Stillwater on the left and East County Line Road. So if you were standing at that sign and turned around, you'd see that view that's on the right, which is a Google Maps image down the road, and you can see the lake in the distance. Well, that's how the kids saw it too, see? So the camp was located about 100 feet from the north shore of White Bear Lake. And this is a map that actually I see there's a much better map in the back, a big map that shows where the railroad was. And that yellow highlight is where the railroad station was. What? Yeah, around the corner. You all can't see it, but if you're curious, you should go look later. Campers celebrated this defining feature in the first line of the camp song, as you see here. Sophie Wirth, the camp that's near the lake, where good friends are easy to make, where the campers and the counselors are true. Just for you, oh, Rihanna. Sophie Wirth will always be true. I think you get the picture here. Okay. For virtually all of its life, the camp, which was originally named the Lake Rest Vacation Home, was run by the St. Paul chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women for the benefit of overtired mothers and their children. I didn't make that up. Among their less prosperous co-religionists. The verdant surroundings, abundant kosher food, and plentiful outdoor activities made for an idyllic setting for the campers. But the decades during which Sophie Wirth Camp existed were tumultuous. World War I and the Russian Revolution, the end of mass immigration to the United States, the rise of fascism in Europe, isolationism in the United States, and anti-Semitism on both continents, all culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. Sometimes these outside events intruded into camp life. What did I forget?
Question, no money.
It comes up, don't worry. Thanks, Judith. As I've noted, Sophie Wirth Camp was established and maintained by Jewish people for the benefit of Jewish people. I'm going to give a little history here, straight history. The founders came from the established German Jewish community, and the campers were from the more recently arrived group of Eastern European Jews who had fled poverty, pogroms, and persecution. For the first half of the 20th century, these sub-communities lived in different neighborhoods and worshiped in different synagogues. Their economic status differed. The German Jewish Eastern European Gulf diminished over the decades Sophie Wirth Camp existed. Maybe we should figure out a better way to do this. But since the group dynamics are important to our story, a bit of background. From 1820 to 1880, about 250,000 Jews from German-speaking regions of Central Europe, who are called German Jews for short, arrived in the United States, sparked by constricted economic opportunities and religious persecution. This was the first wave of 19th century Jewish immigration to the United States. Fewer than 1,000 German Jews made their way to Minnesota during this period. In Germany, government pressure to abandon traditional Judaism and to convert to Christianity led to religious reform within the Jewish community in Germany. By the end of the 19th century, over 80% of Jews living in Germany had abandoned Orthodox Judaism and identified with Reform Judaism, which featured a modernized liturgy and practices such as abandoning the kosher laws, which were called kashrut. These reforms carried over to America. Worship services relied heavily on the vernacular. In Germany, German; in the United States and UK, English, rather than the traditional sacred Hebrew and Aramaic. The first Jewish community in Minnesota formed in St. Paul in the 1850s. It was made up primarily of German Jews. These are people who had established themselves in eastern United States or the southern United States first, and had worked as peddlers and amassed enough capital to start businesses. They were attracted to Minnesota territory by the commercial opportunities in the growing territory. Now, Jews arrived later in Minneapolis in the 1860s. So this is where St. Paul led Minneapolis. This group of Jews founded Minnesota's first synagogue, Mount Zion Hebrew Congregation, today Mount Zion Temple, in 1856. In 1871, they built the modest house of worship on the left at 10th and Minnesota in St. Paul's Lower Town, and replaced it 10 years later on the same site with the more elaborate building that you see on the right. So those are two buildings on the same site. After an initial period of Orthodox practice, Mount Zion adhered to Reform Judaism. This is the community that set up Sophie Wirth Camp. All right, you'll see this slide again. So, a second wave of Jewish immigrants began arriving later in the 19th century, in 1882, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II the previous year, which sparked a wave of pogroms. Until severe immigration restrictions were instituted in the United States in 1924, some 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe immigrated to the United States, as you can see here. Of that number, 30 to 40,000 settled in Minnesota. These religiously observant Jews spoke Yiddish in the home, used Hebrew for prayer and study of sacred text, and maintained the Jewish kashrut dietary laws. It did not take long for a tiny remnant of this initial group of 2 million, and then the 30,000, but 200 arrived unexpectedly at the St. Paul train station on July 14, 1882, marking the beginning of the second wave of Jewish migration to Minnesota. The established German Jewish community immediately came to the newcomers' aid. There were only 1,000 Jews in Minnesota, remember, at the time, in 1882, so caring for 200 refugees, who soon numbered 600 by year's end, was a major task. There was an ambivalent quality to this aid. On the one hand, the German Jews were motivated by genuine benevolence and long-standing religious tradition. On the other hand, the more Americanized German Jewish community feared that the foreign dress and customs of the Eastern European Jewish community would cause an anti-Semitic backlash that would transfer to them. This is the group the camp was established for. 20 of those first 200 Jews settled on the West Side Flats, a 320-acre spit of land across the Mississippi from downtown St. Paul, the first of what would become thousands of residents. So this is a map. I don't know how easily you can see it, but this is a modern map of the Flats. And downtown St. Paul, Rice Park, Raspberry Island, Wabasha Street Bridge. Over to the right is Lafayette Freeway. So on the bottom, let's see, you're right, is where the airport is, St. Paul Airport, and the Home and Field restaurant and all that good stuff. So these are the streets that are still there: Fillmore Avenue, Robert Street, State Street, Eva Street, where my great-grandparents lived, and others. So this is the West Side Flats. I know. Oh. Life on the early flats was hard. Most of the streets were never paved. Very few sewers existed, and the Mississippi River flooded practically every year. Most of the modest frame homes had no plumbing, electricity, or central heating. Kerosene or coal stoves fueled individual rooms. There was no playground on the West Side Flats. Kids played in the State Street dump. Spiritual life, however, was rich. The first of many small Orthodox synagogues was built in 1889, as were religious schools, a sheltering home, and a ritual bath. This is just one of the many synagogues, B'nai Zion, and it's pictured here in the 1950s as it's about to be torn down. Relief efforts for the West Side Jews, as well as others who settled in Lower Town, also known as the 14th Street neighborhood, which was roughly where Regents Hospital is now, was overseen by the Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society, fortunately later renamed the Jewish Relief Society. I mean, fortunately, because it's easier to say. The Relief Society was joined by the St. Paul chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women. The National Council of Jewish Women is the oldest Jewish women's volunteer organization in the United States, and it continues to flourish. Maybe some of you are members, I don't know. The NCJW was founded in 1893, and the St. Paul chapter was founded in the same year, so pretty venerable. This, sorry. Membership in the Jewish Relief Society, which was begun in 1895, and the St. Paul Council largely overlap with the membership of Mount Zion Temple. So these are pretty much the same ladies who are doing a lot of work, a lot of volunteer work, a lot of relief work. The first effort of the Women's Benevolent Society was an industrial school where girls learned home and industrial arts, studied English, and participated in a general Americanization program. The industrial school led to Neighborhood House, a full-service settlement house that added to the above menu activities such as recreation, dental, and baby clinics and programs for adults. And many of you are familiar with Neighborhood House because it still exists on the West Side. It serves a different clientele than it did originally. Like much Jewish welfare work in St. Paul, these efforts were under the supervision of, there she is, finally, Sophie Wirth. It's really hard to find a picture of Sophie Wirth. This is actually a scan of a photo from a book that was a scan, and I worked with the librarian at MNHS, and she tried to find the original, and We couldn't find it, so I think this works well enough. I'm so sorry. So Sophie Wirth is not related to Theodore Wirth. I can't tell you how many times I've already had people ask me that question. I mean, not just tonight. Yeah.
Sophie's related to Feist Animal Hospital in St. Paul?
That I don't know. Someone said no. Do they know that for sure? I don't know. But I doubt it because wait till you hear this. Wirth was born in Germany in 1848. When she was 5 years old, her family settled in Milwaukee. She and her husband, Jacob Wirth, moved to St. Paul around 1884 after a fire destroyed the family business in Milwaukee. In a 1907 article, Wirth was described as a tried and true social worker whose labors in her field have been commented upon by every lecturer upon Jewish relief work in the West. This is a clipping from a newspaper called The American Israelite, which was a national newspaper published in Cincinnati that covered pretty much the German Jewish world of the United States. And it is from 1912, and after the highlighted part, it says it just says that a report on the first year of the Lake Rest Vacation Home was given, this being their trial year. So this is the first year. There's a lot of sources that have a different year than 1912, but hey, I'm going with this and some other things I found too. All right. So as I said, the Lake Rest Vacation Home was formed for the benefit of overtired mothers and their children. Records from the camp's earliest years are sparse to non-existent, so we don't know for sure how the Jewish Relief Society came to select the White Bear Lake site, but there was certainly a need. In 1915, almost 72% of the West Side Flats population was Jewish. This constituted about 463 families. As Paul Nelson highlights in a 2019 article in Ramsey County History, a 1916 survey of conditions in this little district, aka the Flats, noted, that it found 1,200 children under age 16 playing in dirty backyards amidst rubbish heaps, stables, and stagnant pools of water, and in the mud holes of the streets. It was certainly a contrast to the living conditions of members of the Relief Society, who in 1926, this is a membership roster of the National Council of Jewish Women, and I know you can't read all the details. It's as good as I could do in this kind of format, but it lists where they lived, and the streets: Summit, Grand, Goodrich, Lincoln, Mississippi River Parkway, were almost all of them, which I also thought was interesting, that some of the women lived at the Commodore Hotel at the time. Yeah. Probably widows or single women, I would expect. Now, highlighted, and again, hard to see, I know, but one member in 1926 lived in White Bear Lake here, and another in Montemedi. But most of these addresses I mentioned were in the vicinity of the third Mount Zion Temple, their third building, at Holly and Avon, not too far from its present site, which is on Summit Avenue in Hamlet. Now I'm going to try a little feature of this. So this is now an empty lot, but can you see that red dot? Right underneath that, that is the House of Hope Presbyterian Church on Summit. So that gives you a bit of perspective of, a lot of things. Okay. The Lake Rest Vacation Home was part of a larger national movement of fresh air camps, one of many early 20th century progressive era reforms. Progressive reformers felt that children's developing personalities were deeply affected by their physical and social environments. Fresh air camps aimed to remove children from the harmful effects of urban life, such as overcrowding, pollution, criminal elements, and poverty, or having to play in the dump, I guess, while exposing them to the beneficial effects of nature. So in the 1890s, a lot of organizations set up these fresh air camps, settlement houses, Christian organizations, the Boy Scouts, and Jewish philanthropic groups too. So the first fresh air camps, Jewish fresh air camps, were established in New York in 1893. So ours here was established in 1912. Around the country, chapters of the National Council of Jewish Women established similar camps in other cities in the 1920s for mothers and children to escape crowded cities and have a restful vacation, in addition to improving hygiene and health, which included consuming large quantities of kosher food. Another goal was acclimating children to American life. So this is an ad from the local newspaper, American Jewish World. Vacation Rest Camp wants kosher cook. And it also says at the end that management will have no objection to housing children of the applicant during her stay at the camp. So let's finally get to camp. For the camp's first 2 years, the Jewish Relief Society must have been renting the campsite because we have documentation that the possibility for purchase and enlargement of the Lake Rest home was first proposed 2 years later, January 1914, and by the end of the year, the Relief Society received the deed. Not sure from whom, subject for future research. It was received as a, quote, gift of the Jewish people of the city. So we're fortunate to have an early description of the Lake Rest Vacation Home, a 1916 article by Jesse Kalmanson in the American Jewish World, which despite its name is local, a local paper that still exists. It was founded just a few years before this article was published by Samuel Dinard, who was the pulpit rabbi of Sharei Tov, which is today Temple Israel Synagogue in Minneapolis. One of his goals in founding this newspaper was actually to bridge the divide between Eastern European and German Jews. This article provides both a useful description of camp activities as well as the dynamics between camp administrators and campers that I think is so important. So I'm going to quote a little bit of it, actually more than a little bit. So here's the opening. It's kind of breathless and convoluted, I guess like me right now. So here's how the camp was founded. It was 5 years ago this spring when a number of St. Paul's progressive Jewish women with eyes ever open to propositions for constructive work among their less fortunate neighbors, which might tend to improve the conditions under which they were laboring through no fault of their own, conceived the idea of a summer vacation home situated somewhere away from the humdrum of city life, where deserving Jewish women and children who are in no financial position to provide themselves with recreation of even the meagerest description might, with no cause to themselves, receive the invigorating effects of a week's or two stay in the country. I just couldn't resist that being that's quite the opening. So, reporter Kalmanson recounts joining the first group of the season, boarding the early train for the hour's ride from St. Paul's Union Depot to White Bear Beach. He describes the women as tired looking, with babies, and lets the reader know that the Northern Pacific Railway has very kindly furnished passage free of charge, thanks to the efforts of the Women's Society, and that the 2-week stay is free of charge also, and that some of the children's home condition is such that they are accommodated for the whole summer. Here's another direct quote. These mothers and their children, coming from the more humble sections of the city, often are unwell and fatigued before their little vacation, and in many instances are very non-receptive to the invitation to go out into the country. Leaving homes where they eat little, not so much because of lack of food, but because of lack of the desire to breathe the pure air, the blossoming flowers, and Mother Nature in all its splendor soon livens within them a new spirit of health and strength and wholesome appetites. He goes on, I mean, a lot more, but this is just one last excerpt. Quite often, the camp is visited by some of the young ladies, daughters of members of the Relief Society, who teach the girls how to sew and how to do other useful things. And yes, I almost forgot, they all take their daily swim in the lake, mothers, boys, and girls alike. Then there are the auto rides provided by members of the Relief Society, ice cream parties and marshmallow roasts given to each of the groups. Between meals, at 10 o'clock in the morning and at 4 in the afternoon, at the sound of the bell, you can see the children scampering toward the dining hall where they get their cup of milk and crackers. Coming from strict Orthodox homes, for the most part, they need not fear to eat, for all food that is served here is strictly kosher. In addition to Neighborhood House on the west side, referrals to the camp were made from the Central Community House, a settlement house founded in 1921 in that Lower Town / 14th Street neighborhood, the one that's near where Regents Hospital is now, to combat Jewish youth delinquency, and from other Jewish communal groups and agencies. So in other words, referrals to the camp were made from these different social service agencies. Emphasis was placed on improving campers' physical and mental hygiene, with the assumption that their home environments were unhealthy, often due to poverty. In 1918, the Jewish Relief Society and the St. Paul Council of Jewish Women merged. The St. Paul Council took over management and maintenance of the Lake Rest Vacation Home from the now defunct Relief Society. We don't have any documentation from the campers' perspective from these early years, from the 1910s and 1920s. In other words, most of the stuff that's in the archives is from the 1930s. And that picture of the kids in the lake, that's from the 1930s, so I sort of cheated. I'm sort of cheating in some of these to illustrate the talk. But the camp was popular, very popular in the early years. In 1926, a facilities appraisal determined a larger camp was needed, and the Council of Jewish Women created a plan for enlarging and bettering the camp, now finally renamed Sophie Wirth Camp. So 1926. Now, ironically, by this time, Sophie Wirth herself and her adult children and their spouses had moved back to Milwaukee after the death of husband Jacob in 1922. St. Paul Council records show that a YWCA camp adjoining the property was purchased. In 1927, through the generosity of the Albert Heller family, the mortgage on the newly acquired property was lifted. In 1928, new plumbing was installed, as was a lifeguard stand and a complete waterfront department. A craft house was added in 1928. So, Sophie Wirth Camp was flourishing. At the same time, conditions in the campers' home neighborhood, the West Side Flats, began to improve from the most early primitive days. Jewish-run stores and businesses were modernized and enlarged. Restaurants, movie houses, and modern drugstores began to appear. Still, the contrast between the living condition in the Hill District and the Flats remained stark. Now, remember the mothers? Here are some of the mothers. Let's not forget them. So think about it. The kids were at camp and the mothers were at camp. And I hope that the mothers really did take advantage of just being able to chill out and let the counselors feed and entertain their kids. Here's another photo of the mothers. Again, these are from the 30s. But yeah, so there they are at camp. This is the exercise class. And this is just some moms. So I mentioned immigration restriction in 1924. So this meant the stream of new greeners, as we'd say, the greenhorns or new immigrants that began in the 1880s came to a rapid halt with the Immigration Act of 1924, marking the end of unrestricted immigration to the United States. Quotas based on national origin and race were now in place. They limited the number of people, all people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, but particularly, which meant Jews, Italians, Slavs, other quote-unquote undesirables. Cutting off the stream of newcomers who made up the camp's clientele would ultimately become one of the major factors in the demise of Sophie Wirth Camp. Beginning in the 1920s, descendants of the early refugees to the flats began to follow the German Jews to the Hill District around the Dale and Selby streets out of the West Side flats to be replaced by newer Jewish refugees, Lebanese, Syrians, and Mexicans, but the Jewish presence on the flats remained strong. Already living marginally, the Great Depression of the 1930s hit residents of the flats particularly hard. So there was a welfare office that opened in neighborhood house. People took free showers in the locker room. Many things like that to overcome the depression conditions. In the early 1930s, there was such a high demand for spots at Sophie Wirth Camp that camp administrators had to limit acceptances to only those recommended by physicians. In other words, you needed to be in poor health so that you could be rehabilitated a bit at the camp. Others in need were assigned to other camps, in the area. Later in the decade, those who were able paid full price. And there's people who talked to me beforehand who said, well, my parents went there and they were not poor. We'll hear more about that. Improvements to the facility continued in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, there was a large rustic entrance arch, improved playground, gravel approach, and a new horseshoe driveway that were added. More lots were purchased. This kills me. Sanitary toilets were installed in 1935. What did they have before? Outhouses, maybe, just like on the flats, all right. So 3 cottages were dedicated to the Heller, Schwab, and Firestone families. In 1936, the Moses Shapira Memorial Infirmary was dedicated, a gift of Dr. Shapira's widow and her children, a fitting culmination to almost 20 years of constantly rising standards. So I mentioned that there was most of the stuff that we had was from the 1930s. And one thing we have is everybody, if you can't see the screen, I try and get into a position. I knew that this is going to be a film. This is on YouTube, but I have a backup. Haven't we all been to presentations where they say, "Oh, this worked at home," which it did. All right, let's try this. No. Can you see it? No. Don't worry. This isn't the backup. Come on. This has got to work. Here we go. No. Well, this is
on dual screen, so you might have to drag it over.
Yeah, this is the actual film.
So you might have to actually drag this into the invisible screen over here. See if that works. You can still have it play. You're just gonna have to drag it.
Oh, over. I just want to start it over from the beginning, like drag it over like
but
that.
We can't see it on your screen yet.
I know.
Yep, keep going. You're good. Yep. And then you just have to open it up.
Well, now I can't see it because it's on the. Oh.
See? You're on dual screen.
Oh.
So what it does is you just drag it over.
Yeah.
And then you're gonna have to kind of look at this while using your mouse, and then open it up and play it.
Got it. It's worth it. It's 2 minutes of actual Sophie Wirth camp. Here we go. Resume playback. Yes. Please.
It is a little weird trying to do this from a different screen, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
See, then I tried to hit
resume. Okay, because you still need to drag this over more. There we go.
Oh, and can make it big, green.
Yep, I'll make it big.
Green.
Oh, no, don't do upgrade.
Don't worry.
Don't upgrade.
Yeah.
We're gonna pause it for a second, no worries. And then whether or not it'll make it big, it might not, only because they want you to pay for stuff. We'll just do that.
Do you know what that means?
Okay, and this one didn't have sound, correct?
Correct. But watch that stop sign. There they are crossing the road, the camp that's near the lake. They're going to the beach.
Such a good shot. You see parts of the lake right there too? Man's Island.
I heard that, ladies.
Where did you have the year on this one?
1937. Some of them, but some of them were like that guy. He's like a staff person. And then there were teenagers who went to camp, like to 15, 16 years old. You can see it on the YouTube channel of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. I said you can see this on the YouTube channel of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. Now, something's going to happen here that I don't understand. That. I don't understand. 1937.
Yeah, it was popular in Europe.
These are Jews. They're well aware of what was going on in Europe at the time.
Maybe they're like, we're going to salute the American flag instead of Hitler.
I don't know.
How long was Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest in Hamlin?
Oh, we'll talk about that later, okay?
Would you like me to help you?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I have a Mac. So. Thank you. And I fought with lots of classrooms with these.
That's
so.
right.
Okay, so your program is where on your map? Okay.
Okay, then
And
just
then I will drag this guy right back over again.
yeah, and do that thing
And
that
I'll hit the
Nancy did.
present, right?
Yeah, that here this.
There you go.
Okay, next.
Is it another video that you wanted to show?
No, it's the same one,
Oh,
and
well,
now it
hit
works.
Now it works.
Here, just so you see the beginning. All right.
Okay, there you go.
So as you saw, there was a wealth of activities at Sophie Wirth Camp. You even got a view of the craft house and some of the indoor activities. In 1931, campers began to produce a newspaper 5 days a week. It was called the Daily Wirth, and that was the source of many puns later. Beautiful scrapbooks were also compiled by adult staffers, including by the mother of someone who is here today, Idell Churn. I had no idea when I made this slide. Here, up here, stand up, please. Yay. So this is the cover and the inside page of the 1936 scrapbook. Evidently, they're on boards, big boards. These are preserved at the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives at the University of Minnesota, but every single page of all the scrapbooks has been digitized. So you can see every page, and they have a search function. So if you think, hey, my fill in the blank mom, dad, whatever, went to camp, you can, go to these pages and search. And I found people that I knew too. So So these scrapbooks were produced from 1933 to 1939, and it documented things like each of the camper groups with beautiful artwork. At first I thought the kids did this, but I think your mother did this because I started to notice a similar style. So this is, for instance, the Singing Troubadours, and I picked this one because, and Liz and Bill and Julie, one of the campers is Ben Solly, the father of our friend Beth Solly. Isn't that incredible? And he's the guy on the far left. I recognize him. Huh. Ben Solly. Somebody asked, I heard. All right. So luckily we have hard copies of the Daily Worst and of all these scrapbooks. And as I said, they're digitized at the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives at the University of Minnesota. So thanks to these documents, we can thanks to these preserved documents, we can learn about the religious content at the camp. Friday night Shabbos services were a feature with the blessing before and after meals, and quote-unquote Jewish songs were sung after dinner. The first issue of the Daily Worst in every session featured an excerpt from Psalm 24, and a few of the campers named their groups with Hebrew words such as Chalutzim, which means pioneers, or Hatikvas, the hopes, though most had names like doodlebugs and busy bees. Or like these fellows, demons of the diamond. I would say there was an overwhelming milieu of Jewishness, but not overt, explicit religious education or attempts at maintaining Jewish identity, which seemed to be a given, both major concerns in post-war Jewish camps. So what I'm saying is there was a milieu of Jewishness without being overtly educational, but later, after World War II, that was a very specific goal. So look at that. You can see that little picture down there in the bottom, and this is, oops, sorry. There is the picture. And the guy in the middle, the adult, is Dr. Milton Hurwitz. Okay, people know him. I don't know him.
My folks went
Any-
with him and his brother is the
He
dentist.
was the main pediatrician.
I'm from Minneapolis. Come on, people. I don't know these things. So, Dr. Sherling was the main pediatrician in my world. He wasn't a doctor in this picture, but he did this oral history in 2006. Hurwitz had been a camper, though he made it clear that his family situation differed from the majority camper population. He described Sophie Wirth in his oral history as for kids who couldn't afford it. If you were rich and you could afford to pay for it, you paid $14 for 2 weeks at Sophie Wirth camp. There were probably a couple dozen of us who paid our way. I got to do that for 2 weeks. That was really a treat. By 1936, Hurwitz was in medical school and became a medical counselor at the camp in 1936 and 1937. He recalled, "Thank God I didn't kill any kids there with some of the nonsense I was dishing out." Another invaluable document preserved in the records of the St. Paul Council was a 22-page, 1937 season-end report by Leon Addis, a professional social worker who served as camp director in 1937 and 1938. Besides meticulous details of each sport, every sport, a page about everything that happened, all the medical incidents, and all the daily schedules, which you see here, we can find data on campers' average weight gain during the 2-week camp period. Remember, they were here to be fattened up if they could. In his report, campers gained an average of 2.3 pounds in 2 weeks, while one adult gained 9 pounds. How can that happen? And 2 kids gained 7 pounds. This during a season when the entire kitchen staff quit after the first 2-week period of the season. Somebody here said their mom was on the dietary staff. Your aunt. All right. Addis noted that the new staff he hired were more cooperative and served better menus. Weight gain stats were broken down by full pay and partial pay. In other words, he documented, okay, the kids who paid in their way, here's how much weight they gained, here's how much weight the kids who had a partial subsidy gained, and here's how much the kids who were free gained. I guess, yeah, it's just interesting data. So in 1937, we also learned that a significant minority of Sophie Wirth campers came from Minneapolis, 99, compared with 186 from St. Paul and 1 outside the Twin Cities. So there's Leon Addis on the far left. But this is from a brochure, just the top paragraph, and you can see, I hope, that the title says worthwhile, right? It's a pun, worthwhile. But on the right, we see that not everyone was a happy camper. Somehow, this little sheet of paper is documented and preserved at the U. And this is some kid who's being obnoxious, and he calls it worse vile is the camp. He also refers to it as sloppy dirt camp and Slobberpuss Addis, and it's just full of juvenile humor, like that the mosquitoes at the camp were the biggest in civilization, and that Addis is a slovenly psychologist raised in Egypt who drew the smile on the crocodile. Fun stuff, but not so fun stuff. See, the scrapbooks show campers' awareness of the growing Nazi menace. One page on the left, Nazism, from 1939. So perhaps trying to, what's the word I'm thinking of? Hopefully, like minimize. It's nutty. How can this stuff really be taken seriously? But on the right is a program from a play that the kids did called Nazism, and they added the swastikas, or maybe, I don't know, maybe your mom added them, I don't know, but that's a separate page. So this is what I mean by some of the outside world events intruding on the camp life. However, this is a time when Jews are being seen as others, and even in the United States, but some of the Jewish administrators and campers mirrored prejudicial attitudes of the majority culture and created programming, minutes, and publications that in turn portrayed non-white Americans as others, evidence that campers and counselors had absorbed the darker side of Americanization. A local dance teacher and her students demonstrated quote-unquote novel dances of different races and countries in 1932, which is fairly benign. But issues of the Daily Worst portrayed minstrel shows, more than one, also in the scrapbooks, being organized by campers. Blackface images appeared in some of the artwork created by campers and preserved in scrapbooks. So on the left, this is offensive content, warning, but so it says minstrel show. I say, Mr. Jones, what was that big noise in the lodge last night? That was no noise, Mr. Bones, that was a minstrel show. And so it was. Don't tell anybody, campers, but here's a big secret dug up by the snooping reporters of the Daily Worst. Those darkies were not really Negroes at all, but no other than our own campers, Erwin Nahinsky and Lauren Rothstein. And that's a sad and egregious sample, but there were some others. And if you look at the little boys, the one on the far right is making a minstrel puppet. See, I was going to say, I almost didn't say these names because I thought, okay, this is somebody. Really? Wow. The boy on the far left is my dad's really good friend and coworker, Max Wallach. So again, how you go, oh, wow. Who would have ever expected to see a photo of Max when he was a kid? All right, and then finally, just this example of Native American imagery that's ubiquitous, and it was ubiquitous at all camps. I mean, everywhere, all the time, until very recently. But, you know, each group will portray the different parts of Indian life. May the Great Spirit watch over them. Well, they didn't know really about Indian customs, right? Okay, so fundraising. What did it take to keep Sophie Wirth Camp going? During the 30 plus years of its existence, it was the primary social service philanthropy of the St. Paul Council. Minutes show that it seemed to fall on the shoulders of a small group of members who planned all kinds of fundraising events. Apron sales, rummage sales, cabaret evenings, bridge benefits, raffles, and buffet suppers to raise needed funds. These events were also social events. One interesting example of, these are just random fundraising articles, but the apron sale is the oldest one. It's kind of, I think, cute. But the Junior Council in 1937 threw a Social Security party to honor the first lump sum payments paid out by that well-known New Deal program, complete with a vaudeville show, dance, and refreshments in a beer garden atmosphere. These events were covered in the American Jewish world and sometimes in the general press. So of course, when I saw this Social Security thing, I had to look up Social Security. So indeed, 1930, the rule, anyway, I could get geeky on it. But in 1937, they only offered a few lump sum payments, and the regular payments that we are familiar with started later. All right, Judith. From 1927 to the very end, the person most responsible for ensuring the well-being of Sophie Wirth Camp was Irma Firestone, whose granddaughter is here. After reading the newsletters and minutes of the St. Paul Council, I would say if there was another person who might lay claim to having the camp named for her, it would be Firestone. And I didn't know you were going to be here. As chair of the council's camp committee, Firestone took the lead in fundraising, managed the camp, hired the staff, supervised the maintenance of the buildings and grounds, established programs, and made sure the camp was totally kosher as well as safe and enjoyable. Firestone's daughter, Ruth Firestone Bryn, who's Judith's mother, wrote in her 1998 memoir, Bittersweet Berries, Growing Up Jewish in Minnesota, that her mother took her stewardship of Sophie Wirth Camp very seriously. Firestone belonged to the American Camping Association and was knowledgeable about all aspects of camping. Like other members of Mount Zion Temple and the St. Paul Council, Firestone, and this is a quote from the book, did not keep kosher or observe customs. Of her mother, Bryn wrote, Judaism was intellectual and a matter of achieving social justice. Bryn recounts a fascinating incident in Bittersweet Berries. One year, when somehow the menus had escaped my mother's all-seeing eyes, the cook served Jell-O after a dairy meal. Kosher rules require that milk and meat products not be served together. The children at Sophie Wirth were well aware that the gelatin in Jell-O was a meat product. I'm going to pause here, asterisk. I grew up that way too, but it's not really a meat product. I did some more geeking out into that, but even in my time, we thought it was. Yes, but Judith, it is kosher. That's what I looked up, and we kept kosher. And anyway, so let's keep going. I know a food riot ensued. Red Jell-O was thrown all over the dining room, all over everybody's hair, all over everybody's clothes, the tables, and the floor. It apparently took the director, Mrs. Zach, a long time to calm the kids down and even longer to clean up. When my mother heard about it, she was appalled, not only that the children rioted, but that the cooks, both of whom claimed to keep kosher at home, had made the Jell-O in the first place. It is really ironic that my mother was the one to enforce these rules. She wanted to serve the poor mothers who needed vacations and the Jewish children who were living in the slums of St. Paul and Minneapolis and who had no opportunity to experience camping, the natural world, or healthy life of swimming and hiking. To do this, she became an expert at kashrut in spite of her own feelings. A highlight of every season for members of the council and their auxiliary junior or DEB division was the camp picnic or supper. Bryn relays a fundraising technique devised by her father, St. Paul lawyer Milton Firestone. For the camp supper, Mr. Firestone would order the cooks, overweight Mrs. Gorin and tiny, bird-like Mrs. Nymark, to bake the many loaves of bread. He would supply them with a few gold coins to bake in some of the loaves. After the children had eaten, he would auction off every loaf of bread with the enticement that some of them contained gold coins, besides being the most delicious home-baked bread, kosher bread, available anywhere in the whole world. So there at the bottom is an ad for the camp supper from the St. Paul Council Bulletin. Again, all these bulletins and minutes are at the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives, and I read them all. So, final years and legacy. Hints of financial challenges cropped up in the late 1930s. Day camps were begun in 1935 for children whose domestic circumstances didn't allow them to have 2 weeks at camp. Day campers assembled at the Central Community House and were taken in chartered buses. In December 1938, council members were reminded that solving the difficulty expected in operations for next summer's camp will need the help of every council member. Then they instituted something called campships, which were like scholarships. So you could donate $14 as a campship, and that could pay for worthy, underprivileged children the privilege of attending Sophie Wirth camp for one camp period. Those are quotes. Presumably for financial reasons, outside groups, both Jewish and non-Jewish, began to rent the campgrounds. One of the Jewish groups was the Jewish Education Center, precursor to the St. Paul Jewish Community Center, which sponsored camps of their own at the Sophie Wirth camp site in 1938 for designated weeks. This is the Jewish Education Center. It was located in the Hill District neighborhood at Holly and Grotto, a few blocks from Mount Zion, at Holly and Avon. So these campers came from a presumably broader economic spectrum than the low-income population traditionally served by Sophie Wirth camp. And this building is still there. You can still go see it. It is now apartments, and you can see the Cornerstone by Liebenberg and Kaplan, noted Jewish architects. Note the stop sign. This is, the lifeguard crew who would help the kids cross the road. Conditions related to the U.S. entry into World War II also created operational difficulties. Though the 1941 camp season went off without a hitch, and the annual camp supper / social fundraising event raised a healthy $500, minutes and bulletins of the St. Paul Council document that once the season was over, all was not well. In November, the St. Paul Council Bulletin announced that the Jewish Welfare Agency was making an analysis of each child present last summer to find whether the camp has an essential place in our community. And they continued to discuss ways to make money, and they had to withdraw $1,500 from council funds to meet camp expenses. So the next year, at the beginning of the year, a motion was made to close the camp. The motion carried. But a new motion to rescind that decision was made the following month. The camp did operate in 1942 and reported being solvent by season end, most likely because the season was only 6 weeks instead of 8 weeks. The camp report described difficulties recruiting staff and getting needed provisions ascribed to wartime conditions. So on the left is men camp counselors wanted from 1941. This is the first time and only time I ever saw anything in the Jewish world like that. 19 1943 began with continued attention to more difficulties anticipated, including food and gas rationing and difficulty recruiting staff. The camp only operated with a 2-week kosher format in 1943, but the camp wasn't idle. For the rest of the summer, it was used by a number of groups, including the St. Paul Community Chest, which hosted 700 children from throughout the city. It was also used as a youth hostel, and its facilities were used as the country part of a city country camp offered by St. Paul Parks. A lack of food supplies in 1944 prevented the annual camp supper from being held. Council records on one hand alluded to difficulties in funding, and on the other documented continued efforts to promote the virtues of the camp, such as its superior facilities and close-in location, accessible by public transportation. So by that time, this was called close-in, White Bear Lake. Campers that summer were younger, as the older teenage cohort took wartime jobs. Christ Child Organization, the Hallie Q. Brown Center, an African American community center, and the German Social Club used the facilities. And on the right, you'll see an announcement from the St. Paul Recorder that the Camera Club of the Hallie Q. Brown Community House was having a weekend outing at the Sophie Wirth camp. And there's a few other newspaper notices in the Recorder similar, where other groups from Hallie Q. Brown came to the camp. So the camp broke even at the end of 1944, but at the end of the year, the membership voted that the camp not be opened in 1945. So the vote was 52 in favor, 26 of closing, 26 in favor of staying open, and 2 no answer. In spite of the December vote, discussion continued at this meeting. It said it was an extended discussion. So this is after the vote. But ultimately, the same conclusion was reached. Unfortunately, there are no details of the substance of the discussion, but it must have been emotional. The council voted to fund costs of needy children to attend other camps. So for 1945, the whole Sophie Wirth camp was used by the Girl Scouts. And they paid $400, it says, to $500, but at the end of the season, the council was still $100 in the red. So in August of 1945, a motion was made to put the camp up for sale. The initial price was $20,000. The council began to survey community needs in search of a new service project to replace Sophie Wirth Camp. Council records give various reasons for the closing of the camp. The Jewish underprivileged community has so decreased in St. Paul that there is no longer need for a camp such as Sophie Wirth. Another reason given in October 1946 was that the village of White Bear had grown too close to the property to make it a good location for a camp. Furthermore, the St. Paul Council was no longer supporting Central Community House, whose Jewish clientele by this time was nil. Funds still in the budget earmarked for Central Community House were used to buy and donate equipment to Hallie Q. Brown Center.
What's on the site now, Laura?
Oh, you'll see. In 1946, the minutes reported that an offer of $15,000 for the camp was made, but for unknown reasons, the final price obtained the next year was only $12,500, which included some of the equipment. And those darn minutes don't say who bought the camp. And we don't know, right? We don't know yet who bought the campsite. So more subject for future research. The other big announcement in 1946 was that the camp would be used in that summer by the Zionist Youth Commission of the Twin Cities for a new camp to be known as Theodore Herzl Camp. Herzl Camp operated just that 1 year at Sophie Wirth's site. And the picture is Herzl Camp in 1946 operating on the site of Sophie Wirth Camp in some of the buildings. And on the left, of course, is an article, Herzl Camp registrations are started, and the arrow just notes that it is being held on the site of Sophie Wirth Camp. So The following year, Herzl Camp purchased a site in Webster, Wisconsin, where it still exists. The St. Paul Council still had a few loose ends to tie up. In 1947, after moving and seconding that Herzl Camp be granted its request to keep the camp dishes, council minutes stated with finality, this officially closed the books on the Sophie Wirth Camp. I thought that was so dramatic. It's highlighted. 1947. The women of the St. Paul Council moved on to their new philanthropy project, a rheumatic fever diagnostic clinic. So here's a slide that Nancy found. This is an aerial view of the Sophie Wirth campsite where the star, and it's there. At 1951, there wasn't a lot there. I kind of went scouting around in January and didn't really want to trespass too much, but it looks like there's a bunch of houses, right? That's what's there now. The White Bear Lakes site changeover was emblematic of a larger historical trend in Jewish camping. The era of philanthropic fresh air camps like Sophie Wirth was over, replaced by dozens of heavily educational camps designed by Jewish educators and social workers obsessed with ensuring Jewish identity and cultural survival in the wake of the Holocaust and rapid Jewish assimilation into American society. Many post-war camps affiliated with the Zionist movement, like Herzl Camp, Yiddish cultural institutions, and the conservative and reform movements of Judaism took its place. So, to wrap up, the West Side Flats and the 14th Street neighborhoods were places to leave as soon as you were economically able. Post-war prosperity and upward mobility and a devastating flood in 1952 accelerated the movement off the flats. The entire neighborhood was leveled in 1964 in order to build a flood wall and industrial park. But the memory of Sophie Wirth Camp lingered in the minds of many one-time West Side campers. One of these was the social worker and professor William Hoffman. He was born in 1914 and died in 1990. He was also a writer. In 4 books and many, many newspaper articles, he chronicled, somewhat sentimentally, I would say, dozens of tales of growing up on the West Side Jewish community. In 1962, the year the final West Side Synagogue closed, Hoffman devoted a part of one of his Tales of Hoffman columns in the American Jewish World, this one here, to nostalgically reimagining himself as a little boy, wandering away from Sophie Wirth Camp after supper time. So I'll conclude with his words. He remembered trudging down a dusty road without a single care in the world. Before long, he, the little boy, comes to a railroad track and veers off to walk barefoot between the steel ribbons of rail. Counts the ties up to 100, which is by no means the end of his aimless journey, but definitely as high as he can count. And when he comes back to the cottage, he listens to the admonition of his mother for his having wandered away and goes to bed after some cold milk from a crockery pitcher and 3 graham crackers. How deliciously wonderful to walk barefoot down a dusty road and later have a glass of cold milk and graham crackers.